Welcome to the Being Known podcast with my friend, Dr. Kurt Thompson.
My friend, Pepper Sweeney.
Where we discover and explore what it means to be truly known. Today, we're going to be talking about the fifth domain of integration, the narrative domain. This season, we have been continuing to talk about the 9 degrees of integration. And, since it is the narrative, I'm just going to give you, Kurt, the narrative of what's happened to me since we've last seen each other.
Please, by all means.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
So my son, Coleman, moved out the Friday couple of weeks ago, and I helped him move. He moved into this like 120-year-old building. He's on the 4th floor, and it's a walk up. And
congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah. And so we had beds and couches and dressers and all these things to move. And I acted like I was 20 and moved everything with him. And the next day I got up and did a Orange Theory class at 7 a.m. as you do after you move couches and chairs.
Of course you do. Of course you did.
And got home and he's gone now, and he was my gardener for the last couple years. And so my grass, it's springtime here, and my grass hadn't been mowed yet, and it's growing. And I go to mow the lawn, and the lawnmower doesn't work. It's a little 0-turn riding lawnmower, and the blades aren't working. And so I decide that I'm going to take it apart and fix it. Where I got the idea that I could do this, I'm not sure, but I took the blade deck off and lifted the tractor and moved it to the side, which I don't think is really part of the process.
Is that what they showed you on YouTube? How to do that? Is how to lift the tractor?
Lift with your legs, Pepper. With me, trust me.
Lift with your legs.
Yeah, the great teacher YouTube. So. By Sunday morning, I couldn't get out of bed. My back was out, and I was in a lot of pain, and my grass was still growing.
As it is wont to do.
Yes. So I called my lawnmower guy. I called Junior Maxwell, and he came and he picked up both my riding lawnmower and my little trimming push mower that neither of them were working. So he took them away. And the bad part is, my neighbors have already cut their grass twice by this point, and I've not cut mine once. And it's starting to look like a yard just full of decorative grass, right? I mean, it's seedy. The grass is flowering and it's so thick.
It's the lupine lady, only it's her husband.
Yes. And I'm completely embarrassed about it. And so I get a call from Junior, and he says, I got bad news. The part for the riding lawnmower is back ordered, and it's not going to be ready. I'm not going to have it for about a month. So he says, I can bring over the push mower and you can use that. So I said, all right. So he brings it over. I'm thinking, how am I even going to, my back's killing me. How am I going to even do this? So
John Deere sells combines. You can get a combine and just bail
honestly, it. I was about to bite the bullet and go buy something. So anyway, I'm out, I'm cutting my front yard, and it's the lawn is so thick and so high that and the little trim mower has got a bag on it that I do one path across my yard and I got to empty the bag. I got to walk the bag back up into the woods, into my compost pile, and then walk back. So I get about halfway done with my front yard, and I had an appointment I had to go to. So I run out the appointment to the chiropractor, right? Because I'm trying to get my back fixed.
You should have just invited your chiropractor to come to your house. Like every swath, you just get some work done on your back.
Crazy. So I go to the chiropractor. I come home, and my neighbor, Willie, is cutting my grass. I mean, he's got it almost done at this point. And the first thing that happens to me is I'm really embarrassed. I'm embarrassed that somebody else is doing something that I should be doing. You know, I'm embarrassed that I'd let it go this long, all these things. Right. So I grabbed the push mower and I'm trying to do my part and finish, you know, going up these hills in my backyard. And
like a little boy, like keeping up with his dad.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And so he finishes, Willie and Eula, my next door neighbors. I just want to say, I don't deserve these people in my life. They are, they're surrogate grandparents to my kids. I've witnessed time after time, them speaking words of encouragement into my kids. I mean, we moved into this house. I mean, it was worth the price of the house to move in next to them. And so I want to thank him for, you know, and just explain to him about what's been going on, why this is, you know, all this is happening. And he just waves and rides off on his tractor and goes and puts it away and doesn't come back out. And I had to finish up the trimming and all that stuff. And so that was my week. That was my week.
You know, I'm sitting here and I feel Willie's wave in my chest. And I'm imagining that if it were me, and I'd love to hear you say more about this, I'm imagining what the story is that you're telling yourself in that moment. What are, you know, and what are the perhaps multiple threads of a story that are being told that you tell when you see Willie's wave?
Well, in the moment, I was still probably soaking in my embarrassment of the situation. You know, I was probably thinking about the fact that, you know, when I was doing yard work as a kid, it was never good enough. It was never, you know, I never said, you know, job well done. I never heard that.
Never heard that from
my father,
like your dad. Yeah.
And so there was probably this embarrassment that I couldn't do it. I didn't do it.
Yeah.
At the same time, I was grateful.
Yeah.
So grateful.
Right.
I felt undeserving of this person that would do this for me. I mean, you know, who does that?
Right.
And so, yeah, I guess it was a little conflict going on there.
Yeah. Well, Pepper, as we enter into our conversation today about this narrative domain of integration, again, this phrase that we use in this language of interpersonal neurobiology, your story brings it right home, because what we're really talking about with the narrative domain, we're talking about the way we tell stories. In last season, you all remember from last season that we talked about storytelling. We had an entire episode on storytelling. We explored some of the features of storytelling and how those different elements lead to the question of, in what story do we believe we're living at any given moment? And the stories that we've been telling ourselves from the time we were kids, sometimes that get woven into our heads by experiences that we had, and we don't even know that those stories are being written. But we then develop our attachment patterns. We really think about the narrative domain of integration in this field of interpersonal neurobiology in terms of the research on attachment. What does it mean for us to be securely attached not just to each other, not just to our parents, primary caregivers, our teachers, our coaches, and so forth, to our spouses, to our children. How are we securely attached, not just to them, but how does that translate into our sense of attachment to God?
Hmm.
And we come to discover that you can't really separate our attachment from human beings to our attachment pattern from God, because God, as it turns out, has to deal with the same brains that everybody else does when it comes to our experiences in the storytelling, the way that we tell our stories. And one of the things that we talk about when we talk about attachment being this individual interpersonal experience that the newborn and the infant and the toddler has, and that we all continue to have even as adults, wherein which the newborn's immature brain uses the hopefully mature adult's brain to help organize itself. So the baby comes into the world, as we say, looking for someone, looking for him. He comes into the world looking for someone to say, well job on the yard work. Well done. Good job on the yard work. We look for that. We look for our parents' delight. We don't look hoping to be a source of anxiety or distress, or at the very least, we don't hope to be left wondering, did I do a good enough job, when I'm really looking for that? I'm looking for, you don't have to tell me to look for the blessing of my Father's voice. I'm looking for that. I'm looking for the nurture and kindness of my mother's comfort to prepare me to launch out into the deep. As Jesus said to Peter, take this boat out into the deep. We're looking for that. And when we don't have that, if you don't have that growing up, then we're going to make up some kind of a story in the meantime. And this brain of this newborn, this infant, is looking for someone looking for him. And the baby comes into the world with his particular or her particular temperament. And the parents are going to respond to that temperament, and not just to the baby, but they're going to respond to that baby in the context in which that baby arrives. So I know that you already had 4 sisters.
Yeah.
Like you had 5 mothers
and
a dad by the time you arrived. You want to say anything more about that? What that was like?
Yes. So I had, when I was born, the next sibling up was about 4 years old, and then there was a 5-year-old, a 8-year-old, and a 10-year-old. Probably is about where they all were. And when I was born, the doctor brought the baby out to my dad and said, "It's a boy." To which my dad said, "Prove it." I've been here before.
Can't fool me.
Right,
show me.
Right.
Show me the money.
And I came home to a place where, I was probably a plaything to my sisters in the beginning. They like a doll that they cherished, and probably says a lot about me.
Right, I think it does. In fact, I've seen this in audiences. I've seen this when I'm with you. I mean, like, you're just like, we all just kind of stand back and we watch the fawning. We watch, everything that's directed at the most beautiful man in the world.
Right. So
I love doing this with you.
It's awesome. It's just awesome. So, that's how I came in. My story was already being told, before I could tell it myself. You talked about in the story episode that, there are co-writers who begin our story for us, and they write the title, they write the first few chapters before we have words to even speak and start telling our own stories.
Right.
And
right.
Those are the people that started telling mine.
A little earlier, you had mentioned before we started to record this episode, you mentioned that there was an experience that you were told about that your sister tells you. Tell us about that.
Right. So Tammy, the youngest of the girls, recalls this very vivid memory of when they brought me home from the hospital. She went to pick me up, and my dad, got probably nervous and said, don't do that. Don't, be careful. Don't touch him. And she had a very, she still tells the story and can feel
Hmm.
it. And,
Hmm.
you know,
Hmm.
yeah.
Hmm. So we're not trying to make more or less of that, either for Tammy or for you or for your dad, but
Right.
we do want to make the observation that when we come into the world, we come into a world in which we're not the only person there. There are other people who are also having an experience in response to our presence.
Hmm.
And at the same time that you were treated in some sense like special, I mean, because you were the first boy, at the same time, there was at least one moment in which your presence was evoking distress. And again, we're not trying to make more of this than we are, right? We're not trying to say that this was a hugely traumatic event, but all this to say is that your dad has some distress in some way, shape, or form. Again, we're not throwing anybody under the bus.
Right.
Okay, he might be a little afraid, worried, or whatever, but his response then evokes a response in your sister that, like, clearly, if she's now like still telling the story, it made an imprint on her.
Right.
There's an impression that and even though you're a newborn, your developing mind senses what's in the room in this moment, in your presence. And so this is an example of how we come into the world, and our presence then evokes a response in our parents. Our parents respond to us. I think I've said before too that I was the fourth of four sons, but they were all much older than me. And my mother was 44 when I was born in 1962. To be pregnant at age 44 at that time was distressing. It was anxiety provoking. And so before I was a source of joy, I was a source of anxiety. And not that I knew this cognitively, not that anybody told me this, of course, after I'm born, growing up, but we sense it, we feel it in the environment, we sense it in the way that we talk nonverbally, because as we've said before about when we were talking about the hemispheres and the different ways that we communicate, like our nonverbal cues carry so much weight in the way that we tell our stories. And so we then, as infants and newborns and infants, we then, in response to our parents' response to us, we then will attach to them without even knowing what we're doing. We don't need language. We don't need cognition. We develop an attachment pattern to the way that they are responding to us so that we can regulate our own brain. We can organize our own sense of being stable in the world. And remember, being stable, that word stable, when you hear, well, they're in stable condition in the hospital, it means that we are relatively unchanging and predictable. It doesn't mean that I'm well. It just means that I'm stable. I'm not getting better, getting worse. I'm stable. And I move to stabilize myself. And if I'm living in a community, if I'm living in a family in which people are really paying attention to me with enough attentiveness that helps me sense that I'm being sensed, I then learn to co-regulate my emotional states with other people because they're paying attention to those things. And the way that they're responding is, though imperfect, the way that they respond demonstrates that they are paying attention to me being in the world. And so when that happens, when we have parents that are with us in the world in a way that really demonstrates their capacity to be comfortable with our presence, even with our presence in the presence of our siblings, and the way this system has now changed because there's now 5 kids in the system and not 4. And there's 1 boy and 4 girls. And how is all that changing? As we like to say, no sibling ever grows up in the same household.
Yeah.
We all have our own particular ways of going about that. And what we discover is that there are then different ways that we attach, and those attachment patterns can be relatively secure or insecure. We know some things about these attachment patterns. We know that I develop an attachment pattern with particular individuals, so that my attachment pattern with my mom might be different than it is with my dad, might be different than it is with my teacher or my coach. I also, for the most part, have a fairly stable attachment pattern established by the time I'm about 7 months of age.
Wow.
So it happens early. Interestingly enough, we talked a little bit, we've hinted at this notion when we talk about shame, and we'll come back to that shame plays a role because shame shows up as early as 6 to 18 months, 6 to 15 months of age in our life. We can start to have it weaving its way in and out of our attachment processes. And we have then varying degrees of attachment patterns. And, there's a really interesting study done by Richie Davidson, who's a professor of psychology and a researcher who did this work at the University of Wisconsin. I'm just going to take a minute to talk about this. It's a 25-year long longitudinal study with a group of kids who were determined to be constitutionally shy. So he was doing all this research on what is it like for kids who are shy. And by shy, we mean I'm relatively less comfortable with novel circumstances, whether that's like new experiences on the playground, new experiences with people. I'm a little more reticent to enter into those. Or kids who are less shy, kids who are more left brain dominant, they tend to be out there, go get, like I'm less distressed by novel stimuli. If we take those kids who are shy, more right hemispherically dominant. In that sense, my right hemisphere tends to be kind of like more like I'm taking in the world, watching it as a whole thing before I jump into it. Mm-hmm. If you take those kids who are shy and you follow them for 25 years, what do you discover about their attachment patterns? And here's some things that were really interesting. After 25 years, Dr. Davidson discovered there were at least 3 groups that shook out of this. And group number 1 was a group in which the parents, and as it turned out, we watched the kids, and then you discern like, oh, there were like similar kinds of parenting strategies that took place. And group number 1 was a group of kids who, when their parents recognized that they were shy, their parents decided, I know that this kid is shy. I really want this kid to be able to be okay in the world. And so we're going to toughen them up, which means we're going to push them to do hard things. We don't want the world to swallow them. And so we are going to push them into hard things, do hard things. And in that sense, those parents didn't pay that much attention to the child's mind in terms of where the child was feeling distress. The parents would just keep pushing them. And what was interesting about this 25-year longitudinal study, 25 years go by, and those children who are now adults and out in the working world were then explored, and the researchers talked with other people who knew these people as adults. And they talked about how to work with these people. These were people who were fairly hard charging. These were people who worked really hard. They were perfectionistic. They got a lot of stuff done. But they were also people who could be pretty critical. They were people who, people who would work with them would say like, yeah, they're kind of tough to work with because they're like super demanding and there's not really much grace given by these folks. Like they're just on it all the time. And when you then talk to the subjects themselves, they would say, yes, I remember being shy and I remember my parents are driving me pretty hard. And that's what's gotten me to where I am today. But they would also say that underneath this, they still felt this sense of insecurity. This insecurity of not being okay in the world, and the way that they respond to this is that they push harder into the world, not paying that much attention to their own emotional states, nor necessarily being that aware of other people's emotional states. And this fits a pattern of what we call an insecure avoidant attachment pattern. This notion that we are insecurely attached, and in this way, what we mean is that I don't avoid emotion, meaning like I know what I feel, I'm just not going to pay attention to it. It means like I've worked and practiced so well to not pay attention to it at all that I don't even know that emotion is really kind of coming up for me. It doesn't mean that it's not affecting me, as we talked about in our episode on emotion last season, but it's still something I'm not very aware of. I don't see it as being useful to me. I don't think of it. I don't pay that much attention to it. I don't see it as being helpful in informing me about the nature of the relationships that I'm in. And so other people then experience me as being kind of hard charging and insensitive to them. The second group turned out to be folks who their parents also recognized their child to be shy. And they had a different approach. Their approach was to protect their kids from all harm. And so they didn't push their kids. They were worried that the world would overwhelm them. And so they just pulled everything back. You know, if the kid didn't want to do something, they don't make them do something. Always moving to protecting the kid from the world as opposed to thrusting the kid into the world. And these were kids who, by the time they got to be adults, they would be described as people who had a hard time staying with things, people who had a hard time being confident about things, people who their colleagues working with them also had challenges with them because they couldn't always be dependent upon, because the moment that they would reach like difficult moments, they would like need somebody else to come help them. So they appeared to be somewhat overly dependent in their experiences in the world. When you ask them about their life, they would say, yes, I remember being shy and I wish that my parents had made me do harder things, because I just feel like I can't, like I'm aware that I don't feel like I have much resilience in the world. And these are people who also would tend to fit what we would call an insecure and anxious attachment pattern. Now, what we're talking about today with these different patterns of security and insecurity, these are patterns in which we're being somewhat overly simplified as we're describing them, because there's a whole research literature on them and different kinds of instruments that are used to measure this, the adult attachment interview, the infant strain situation. But all that to say is that this group would have been insecurely attached because they're anxious. Like, I don't know if you're coming or going. Like, my parents sometimes would be with me and sometimes they're not with me. My parents sometimes would be with me and they're overwhelmingly with me, even in my space when I don't want you to be there. And so I kind of grow up always kind of worried about where relationships are going to be. I, in fact, think a lot about emotion and am uncomfortable with it because I don't know if you're going to be with me or not with me. And if you are with me, are you ever going to be overwhelming me? And so for the first group that's insecurely avoidantly attached, emotion doesn't mean much for them. In this group, the insecurely anxiously attached, emotion means a lot, and it's not always very comfortable. And so they're constantly like worried about where's the next, where's my next emotional meal coming from? And of course, they were folks who lived this out in their adult life, as demonstrated by the people who would work with them in their friendships that were also interviewed in this study. Then there was the third group. And you all kind of see where this kind of like Goldilocks and Three Bears is going, right? Okay, right? And it's like you could
these parents were just right.
They were just right. And in fact, these were people who would have described their experience growing up as parents who were attentive and attuned to them, were what we would call, they were mentalizing them. They were paying attention to the activity of their child's mind. They recognized that their children were shy. They recognized this. Oh, and the second group that I just described, they would say, yes, I remember being shy. But this third group, they would say that they had parents who recognized this, and they would push them far enough, but not too far. They were bringing them along. They were noting when they were working hard. When they would see that they were being overwhelmed, they would pause. They would pull back on the throttle, if that makes sense. And as these folks grew into maturity and as adults, some really interesting things came out about what it was like to work with them. People would say, they make great leaders, but they also make great followers. These are people who, no matter where they are in their work life, whether they're in a leadership position per se, or whether they're in the ground level of stuff that they're having, these are people who work hard, but they're also able to set proper limits for themselves and for other people. They are people who are not afraid to make mistakes, and they are people who, when mistakes get made, they work to repair them. When there are ruptures that take place in relationships, they move to repair them. These are people who found themselves to be really comfortable in their own skin. But here's another thing that was really interesting in this study. When they were asked, so what was it like for you to remember being a shy kid? And they almost to a person would say, I don't remember being shy. Their story was effectively told very differently because of how their parents interacted with them. Now, there's one more piece of information that's really interesting. And that is, all of these folks as adults were given studies, what we call PET scan studies, in which we look at the brain activity and the kind of excessive hyperactivity, especially of the amygdala. the part of the brain that helps register fear for us, the part of the brain that when we are shy is kind of on overdrive. It's looking at the world as a relatively unsafe place, even though we wouldn't call it unsafe, but it's an uncomfortable place, right? Novelty is uncomfortable for me. Every single one of these adults, their amygdala were still hyperactive. Even the ones who didn't find themselves remembering that they were shy. The brain's amygdala was still firing, but the beauty is that the parenting work of the parents helped the development of the prefrontal cortex of these kids to override the fear of the amygdala. And these were kids who had secure attachments. These were kids who paid attention to emotion, and in which over the course of their lifetime, as they experienced more and more difficult emotion, their parents helped them regulate that. Their parents helped them, as we like to say, expand their window of tolerance, to widen my capacity to feel things in ways that might be difficult initially, but I learned how to incorporate that into my life. And so as I relationally interact with other adults, I anticipate and expect to be interacting with those adults in ways that would be commensurate with that healthy, securely attached pattern. And when I interact with adults who are not able to do that, I fairly effectively am able to do one of two things. I either work to deepen our relationship and bring that relationship along, or I discover this other person isn't really up to that, and I'm going to set a limit and not have a relationship with them that is going to be unhealthy. I'm going to set a limit on that. These are the three more prominent ways that we talk about attachment. There is a fourth way that we talk about that is disorganized. I'll give you an example of that. I have a patient who, when I began to meet with him in his mid-30s, he would describe that as a kid, he was about 5 and he had 2 younger siblings. And his father would put them to bed at night. And when his mom wasn't there, his father would put them to bed at night. And after the dad has turned the lights out, everybody's put to bed, his dad would begin at one end of the hallway of their upstairs house and start to kind of moan and yell and scream as a monster coming down the hallway in the dark after he's put the kids to bed. And of course, everybody was just scared witless. And of course, as this young man was doing work in therapy with me and he's recounting this, I'm like, gosh, that just sounds awful. And he was like, yeah, I never really understood. Well, in the course of our work together, he eventually went back and had a conversation with his dad. And he's like, why did you do that? Because like he remembers like being afraid himself, but also like his 2 younger siblings would get upset. And he would then be in this position of having to comfort his younger siblings because his dad wasn't really, he would just like, well, why? You don't need to be upset. You don't need to be upset. I'm just having some fun. And his dad later would say, I think I was just trying to connect with you guys. Okay. This is not a father who didn't love his kids.
Right.
This is a father who loved his kids, but the father himself was not loved well enough as a kid himself to be able to be aware of his impact on the developing minds of his children. And so this 35-year-old, then in the work that he was doing, began to come to terms with the fact that that kind of trauma, and we think like that's not sexual abuse, it's nobody's being beaten, but it was still like a fairly common thing that would happen. It would disorganize the children's mind's ability to be able to trust the very person that they need to trust in order for their safety and security. Here's their dad who's just 10 minutes ago put them to bed and is now behaving like a frightening monster. Like, how does one learn to trust this if you're a 2-year-old? How do you do this? This can be disorganizing, which means that any kind of move toward intimacy can be actually quite disintegrating. The very act of a move toward intimacy, a move toward a bid for attachment, then creates a certain sense of distress within me. So the very thing that I long for, I long to be known. I long to be seen. I long to be heard because I want to, like we all do, we all long to be seen and heard in order for us to then go on to create beauty and goodness in the world. I have a hard time creating that beauty when every time I get close to intimacy, the ground under my feet starts to move, and I don't even have a clear understanding of why that's happening. And so one of the things that we then discover is in the course of this attachment, we don't just have feelings about emotion. We don't just have patterns of connecting with relationships. It also shapes the very way, by the time I develop language, it shapes the way I begin to tell the story about my life. Without me knowing it, I began to tell the story of my life in a way that said, I'm a source of anxiety and I have to work really hard to make sure that I don't make people anxious or make people angry, or there's going to be trouble. And so I'm working really hard. I'm working overtime to ingratiate myself. And of course, because I know that if you look like you're ingratiating yourself, like that doesn't work either. And so you have to do it without looking like you're doing it. And so you become really, really good at putting on these certain roles. And I think about your story, Pepper, and I think about like the whole notion of how beautiful it would be for you as a kid growing up in the work you're doing in your yard, for your dad to come and say like, dude, I see how hard you're working. Like, and you're the one who's working. Like, where are your sisters? Like, I don't know where they are. They're your sisters, right?
Don't start with that.
Okay. Because I'm sure. I'm sure. Right?
Down that road.
Okay. Right. But like to have him say, I'm just really proud of how hard you're working. I'm really proud of how, because I know that you're working really hard. You're going to school, you're doing this, you're doing that. We're in the summertime, like you've got these things. Thank you so much for doing this. If we don't hear that, if I don't hear that voice, like our first group of folks, if they don't hear the voice of their parents who are saying like, I see how hard you're working at this. And to be able to like acknowledge how hard it is to be shy, how to acknowledge that, but still to kind of like bring them along. They weren't able to do that. They were just pushing. Then when you see Willie cutting your lawn, you can be grateful, but it also like draws out this specter of like, well, why didn't you get this done? How did you like, and all the things that come behind that. And yet at the same time, Willie gives you the experience of being seen, soothed, safe, secure. And receiving that gift is one of the hardest things that we do then, because we like to talk about this notion. And this is the beautiful thing about attachment research. We learn that if we are insecurely attached and we begin to develop relationships with people who are paying attention to us in beautiful, meaningful ways, we can develop secure attachment. We aren't left alone with our insecure avoidant or insecure anxious attachment. We are not left alone with this. In the same way, God comes to us in Jesus and says like, I'm not leaving the room. I see your distress. I see your brokenness and I'm coming to heal that. And the moment that he gets that close, I'm like, whoa. Like, I like the idea of this, but I'm not sure that I actually like this. And there is this war, like I am the war inside, right? John Foreman in Switchfoot, I am the war inside. Skirmishing, pitched battle with God's attempt to come for me. It's like that burning one in The Great Divorce where C.S. Lewis, he comes for the guy, the creature on the guy's shoulder, may I kill it? Right. And the guy doesn't know what he wants him to do. This is what secure attachment looks like because it requires work on our part. We call it earned secure attachment, not because we do all the working, but there is a certain effort that we have to put into allowing this intimacy to take place. For a lot of people who are married, y'all who are married, you know what this is like. You thought you knew them. As I tell people, like, look, when you commit to marrying the person on the day you get married, you aren't really committing to that person. Like because you have no idea who this person is. Heck, they don't even know who they are. You're committing to commitment. I'm committing to like, I'm going to stay in the room with you. And of course I'm committing to you. But as we grow together, we discover like, oh my gosh, like the intimacy with which you come to me, like touches the parts of me that have not yet been securely attached. And so I'm going to have to work at allowing myself to be loved by you in ways that at first glance, I'm like, ugh, I didn't know that this was going to be like this. And so I'm I just want to say, like, I'm just so pleased for you that Willie is in your life. And I also want to say, like, I really get it that having Willies in our life, like, it gives me the Willies, right? There is the sense, like, it, right? Willie gives me the Willies. Like, he
Right.
gives me himself. And in so doing, it both, like, I both welcome it and I'm made anxious by it.
Right.
And this, in many respects, is the work of integration.
Mm.
It is the work of what the Bible would call sanctification, my allowing myself to be loved, so that I will then only see Willie's gift to me as a source of how I can then, with joy, continue to give to the people in my life as a result.
Yeah, I appreciate that perspective. It's interesting to me that we have, in the example of the 3 shy kids and their parents, we have the third set of parents who are co-regulating the narrative so that the child then can tell a different story about themselves.
Absolutely.
So the other thing is that kid that was in the bed that was too hard and the one that was in the bed that was too soft, there's still hope for them, because
Absolutely.
you can co-regulate. You can have people co-regulate as an adult.
That's right.
We don't give up because our parents didn't meet all of our emotional needs, because no parent is ever going to meet all of your
Right.
emotional needs.
Right.
You have to
Right.
find people in your life. You have to do the work to find people that are going to co-regulate with you, that are going to
Right.
love you, that are going to hear your story. Right.
Right. Right. Well, you think about the Gospels, and I'm currently reading through the Gospel of Mark, and you get to the 2nd and 3rd chapter, like right out of the chute, Jesus is doing all these amazing things, and right along with it, right, shame is traveling right with him. Right. It's like he heals the guy with the withered hand and he goes on and he breaks off seeds on the Sabbath and his disciples eat it, and he's doing beautiful, good things in the world, and he's in, like, and people are coming to, like, what are you doing? What's wrong with you? And people are coming from hither and yon to be with him, to be healed and transformed. And the neighbors complain to his family, and they say, and this is the first New Testament psychiatric admission to say, he's losing his mind. This is what the gospel says. You need to go and get your boy because he's losing his mind. And this whole notion that when goodness comes into the world, shame wraps its tentacles right around it. It wants to come in and out. And it wanted to tell Jesus, like you're a whack job, dude. There's something wrong with you. And not only that, but he's getting that message directly from his family, right? His family could have said to the neighbors, hey, I'm not really sure if you know who this cat is, but, like, you're going to be hearing about him for a long time. Long after, like, your kids are dead, people are going to be hearing about this guy. No, they don't say that. The parents respond to the neighbors by them being anxious, and they got to go, like, contain this because this is embarrassing. Like, we don't know what to do with this. And so from the very beginning, right, the gospel says that God is coming, and it doesn't matter that our stories from of old, from the time of Adam and Eve, and from the time you and I have come into the world, Pepper, where shame has wrapped itself around and causes me to tell a story, just like the neighbors were telling the story, that, like, they weren't telling the story like, this is amazing, this, the Messiah has arrived, right? The good shepherd has arrived. The living water has arrived. No, they're like, this guy is out of his mind. In the same way, we also have voices that are telling us similar kinds of things and have been telling us similar kinds of things. There's something wrong with you. You're out of your mind. You think you're the living water. No, you're not. You're a problem, and we need to solve you by shutting you up. And Jesus does the work. This is where we would say, look, there were all these voices trying to tell him who he was. And this is where in the Christian story, in Christian anthropology, then theology, we would say, like, the Holy Trinity is a community whereby which Jesus had his dad's voice in his ear. And his voice said, I love you. I can't believe that we get to do this work together. You are my son whom I love. This is the dominant co-regulating voice that Jesus is listening to. And so you're right, Pepper. Our work in moving toward earned, secure attachment and telling a different story, telling the full story of what Willie is trying to tell you about you, that you are loved. And because you are loved, I cut your grass. And I want you to feel the very thing that your kids have heard from me. I'm not just going to be like a surrogate grandfather to your kids. I'm going to be your dad where you needed your dad to be what your dad maybe at times couldn't be. I'm going to mow your grass. I'm going to wave to you and say like, well done. Well done trying to do all the hard work of mowing the grass and working on the tractor and throwing your back out because like you've just lifted your kids' furniture up 4 flights of stairs. Well done being a husband. Well done being the worker that you're being. Well done. And in the middle of all that and your back being thrown out, I'm coming for you. I'm coming on a tractor and I'm going to mow your grass. And all I want you to do is just receive it. Bask in it. And this is the voice that Jesus has to pay attention to when his family comes and says, hey, what are you doing? You're not getting the grass cut well enough. You should be at home working on building door jams. That's what you were trying to do. It's like, I'm about my Father's work. And we are our Father's work. Our Father who comes to us in Jesus, our older brother, says, I'm not leaving the room. I'm here to cut your grass. Because I see how hard you're working. I think it's really important for us to be asking the question, who are the people who are in our lives who are regularly helping us co-regulate, regularly helping us tell the story that God wants us to be listening to and telling, such that we aren't believing the lies that the world, the flesh, and the devil would want us to hear, but we are believing and hearing the story that you are my son, you are my daughter, in whom I delight. And I have work of beauty and goodness for you to create. And it may actually be in the very places where you least expect it to take place.
I want to just thank you for changing the narrative of that story for me. You helped me already take something that, as I confessed, I was embarrassed about, to now see as the pure gift. And as I picture Willie just riding away and waving to me and smiling, not expecting anything in return. It's helping me to, even in this moment, draw closer to God, to see a tangible picture of Jesus coming to my rescue. And just giving me a little wave and a smile. So thank you.
Well, Pepper, you're welcome. You are welcome. And I think about the ways. Again, we've mentioned this before. I think about the number of conversations that you and I have shared over the last 8 years, in which I have named things about my story for which I have felt deeply embarrassed. And it's not just like, in some of those cases, it's not just a matter of, shame like showing up in one big chunk. It's like shame shows up in these like tentacles, in these nooks and crannies, kind of like, it'd be one thing if you just say, oh, there's the shame is in that's the shame room. And you go in and you just like clear that room out. No, it's like, there's a little bit of shame in every room in the house. I mean, it's hard to find. It just shows up. And so, it's this felt sense of, I can say something, I can tell you a story, and you're being able to help me co-regulate that, helps change the narrative of the story. The challenge is that the story is old enough and ancient enough, or maybe it's strong enough that, the next time I talk to you, that story hasn't been completely resolved. It's not completely healed. And so then there's the part of me that is embarrassed that I'm still having to tell you, like, it's not resolved. Like we had that conversation, like 3 months ago, and now I'm back, and it's like the same thing hasn't worked itself out. And like, now I'm embarrassed that I haven't taken care of my shame, like fully. And you don't leave the room. And I know that you have, and I have other relationships in our lives. Even Amy, who's part of our production here. I mean, we've shared things with her. I mean, I not only do I need a person, not only do I need you in my life. It's not like, well, here's my list of shame things. I'll tick them off one at a time. It's like all these, they seem to like continue to they will repeat themselves. And so I got to come back to the same story with you over and over again at times, it seems. And you're like, no, it's okay. I'm not leaving the room. We're going to keep at it. We're going to keep working on the lawn. And so I'm just really grateful for our friendship, and that you have been a person that God is using to help me retell my story. I've as I've said, there is this part of me that believes that before I'm anything else, anytime I meet somebody, I'm a source of anxiety, even before I meet them. There is this old, ancient narrative that's wrapped up in my interpersonal neurobiological wiring. That's, it's pre-verbal. It's not like I know this is a fact. It's this felt sense that I feel in my chest. And one of the things that we often say is how much humor we've talked before. When we talked about neuroplasticity in last season, we talked about how humor is a way that we actually help mobilize our neural networks. We loosen them up, and we then give them space and room to move, right? And I also want to just testify to the fact that the humor that we have shared in the time that we have been friends and loved one another has been one of the most helpful things that has enabled me to continue to believe that you really want to be in the room with me. Despite the fact that there are these old neural tracks that evil will want to continue to try to activate, just like Jesus' family was trying to impress upon him what the surrounding neighbors had impressed upon them, that there's something wrong with you. And before you're anything else, you're a source of anxiety, right? Because look, it would have been fine if you'd been born into a family in which your parents had already been married by the time she got pregnant. But like Jesus, before he was anything else, was a source of anxiety. You can see this, right? Could potentially have been with Mary. And there's this, the world is going to want to tell a story to him about him. Well, did you know that your parents weren't married when your mom got pregnant? How many people probably said that to him? He said, oh yeah, you're Joseph's son. Yeah, well, so they say. Right? I mean, like you can imagine.
Right.
And all the work that Jesus has to do to pay attention to the Spirit and to his Father. And I am just so grateful that you have been the voice of the Trinity, and that Amy has been the voice of the Trinity, and that, you have friends who have been that for you. And I hope I can, be part of that for you. And I long for you all to each be thinking, who are going to be people who are going to help me imagine that what I'm really doing is living in the world, living in the dance of the Holy Trinity, living in this world in which the Trinity is inviting us to come and join this party, join this celebration, join this endeavor to be deeply known in such a way that we move toward an earned, secure attachment, whereby which we seek joy, we understand ourselves to be a source of joy, and even when there are ruptures, that we anticipate that those are simply opportunities for the repair work that leads to even greater resilience, greater depth of connection, and that I anticipate and hope for and expect with confidence that that's what's going to happen. And we even recognize that evil will want to change things for us. It will want to tell us, you're out of your mind. We want you all, Pepper and I and Amy, we want you all to know that the Holy Trinity wants you to know that you're invited into this space in which those places of insecure attachment, those places of traumatic events and shame that seem to tentacle themselves around your life, your brain, and the story that you tell about yourself, the story that you tell that other people tell about you, that those are opportunities for a new story to emerge. Those are opportunities for the renewal of your mind, the changing of your brain, and the securing of your attachment to Jesus, who is the way, the truth, and the life. Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God. Kurt, thank you so much for today. I say that all the time, but I think even more so today, just for giving me some personal insight, was really a gift for me. I hope that this is a gift for all of our listeners, and we'll be back at it, and I can't wait.
We will. Yeah. I can't wait either. And I would. It's almost as if like we got to find, like, we need to send Willie a gift card or something. We need. I feel like he's provided so much material for our time today.
Right.
It's like, God came to us in the form of Willie. And as far as we know, it's free Willie. There we go. I mean, Kurt's just gonna. Oh goodness. Like, okay, Kurt, it's time to stop. It's just time to stop. It's time to stop.
Oh, Kurt.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
This is great. Thank you so much. I love you, buddy.
Until next time, I love you, man.
Until next time.
Talk soon.
Yep.
I'm listening, I'm watching while you guys are talking. So Willie, he saw you, Pep. He cares for you. Out of his care, he mows your lawn. And then he doesn't look for accolades. He just waves and goes on his way. And then Kurt, you said, you were re-experiencing that wave and talking about what was felt in that, and what I felt, and Pep said he felt shame. And for me, I felt, don't settle into that feeling of care and love, because it's going away. It's not going to last. It was just a momentary, mowed your lawn, da-da-da. And then what hit me was what we've talked about before, is that what we remember, we pay attention to. What we pay attention to, we remember. Mm-hmm. And what we remember becomes our anticipated future. So I pay attention to going away.
Right.
I mean, it's not lost that it's a wave, because that's usually going away. And then I expect that. And so that story I relive it. And I almost create it on my own by expecting that.
Yeah. Oh, we do.
And it's the very thing we long for. We long for that connection, which you said, Kurt, of some Willie, but we can't receive it because of our story.
Yeah. That's, I mean, okay. So I'm in the middle of what I would consider to be a bit of a pitched battle internally, have been for several weeks, around about a month and a half ago, I just became, what was brought to my attention in a time of meditation was brought to my attention, but this incident that happened when I was about 4 years old, and my mom was going away for a conference, and I was aware of this, but I thought the whole time that she was like, I was going with her. And the night that she's leaving for the conference, the folks come to pick her up at the house. She's going, and I'm like ready to go, and like
picking up your bag.
I mean, I don't have a bag, but I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to go, and right, I'm picking up, and she's like, no, and it's only then that I become aware, like, I'm not going, and I have this vivid memory of just dissolving, like I was inconsolable with this sense of going away. Now, what's striking to me is I'm aware that my father was not upset with me at all. I think he tried to be comforting, but I don't have any memory of my mom sticking around. I mean, she probably said, "No, I'll be back." I mean, like I'm confident that that's probably what she did. But my felt sense was that I got overwhelmed with this sense of departure, and that there wasn't. Again, nobody's being thrown under the bus. It's not like people like made these huge mistakes. This is not about trauma in that sense, in that intentional sense. But like, I'm left with this kind of this laceration that doesn't get addressed, and so it covers over, and it leaves this wound internally, but that gets covered over on the surface, that becomes like this crevasse, right? This sense of like, I'm left. I am being left. Like this, it's not like I'm going to be left. I was left. It's like I am in the process of being left. Like that is the undercurrent that I'm living with.
Right.
And so I'm discovering that, like, oh my gosh, how much of my life has been, the story of my life has been told that the thing that I most deeply long for comfort, necessarily, like it is wound around with this shaming felt sense of I'm being left by this very thing that I most deeply long for. And so what do I do then? I move to clutch it. I move to hoard it. I move to hang on to it. I move to the Bible would call this, Gerald May would call this addiction. The Bible would call this idolatry. I construct things as a way to hold, but the very act of holding on to it, because I'm having to tell my story by myself, to regulate, because I'm regulating this stuff on my own, the very act of hoarding, of clutching, of consuming, merely reinforces the narrative that, yes, you are alone, which is why you have to do this. You are alone. And so it only reinforces the very act of holding on to the thing that I long for comfort, reinforces the anguish of being alone. Until I have an experience with you, Amy, with you, Pepper, in which I, oh my gosh, give myself enough time to look at you looking at me and pay attention to you not leaving. Because like, I'm telling you, like the moment you look at me with any kindness, it not only feels like it, not only do I feel the depth of that comfort, but I feel the access to the story of like, I'm being left. And the work that is required to pay attention to you and not to my story,
Yeah. Mm.
like it feels Herculean. It feels like it's a full-time job.
Mm-hmm.
It's 2 full-time jobs.
Mm-hmm.
Because I got to do it during the day, and then I got to do it at night, when, and then I got to do it before I even get to work.
Mm-hmm.
I got to do it in my sleep.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And sometimes the work, like just noticing, that's curiosity on, I mean, like just being able to be curious about like, my reaction to that was, well, it's going to go away. And it's like, oh my gosh, that is the story.
Right. And Pepper, you're that whole thing, it really, really just like hit me right in the nose and knocked my glasses off because they're attached.
Attached, yeah.
Yeah. The whole sense of like, here he is mowing your grass, and you're like, and there's the part of me like, oh, what a sweet thing. And you're like, you just feel ashamed.
And I can't tell you how, I mean, it's not gone.
No,
It's not gone. I still feel it. As much as I even have a different perspective of the moment and everything now,
Right.
It's work. It's so much work.
It is. Right. So I think there is the painting. I'm blanking on the artist. I think that both of you would recognize it immediately. I don't know if it's 14th or 15th century maybe, but it's the painting of the courtyard. I don't know if it's with Pilate or if it's the courtyard of Caiaphas and Ananias the high priest, and Jesus is coming out and Peter is turning away because it's just after he's denied him for the 3rd time. And Peter is turned away in shame, and the painter has Jesus looking in Peter's direction, but Peter can't look at him. And Jesus is in the distance enough that I can't, I've never seen this painting in person, so I don't know how big it is and how able we are to see what Jesus' look actually is. But I can imagine the painter wanting to depict Jesus as having this look of kind of, some combination of resignation, sadness, I told you so, kind of, whatever. And Peter's response, of course, like he doesn't even want to look at him, although Luke's gospel is just the one place that it shows it, right, where it says, and Jesus looked Peter straight in the eye. And I keep wondering to myself, what did Jesus really look like? Mm-hmm. What was his gaze really like? Was his gaze one of resigned, I told you so? Or was his gaze this notion of like, I know that we both know what we both know. I'll see you in 3 days. Mm. I'm coming to find you. Like this, and it reminds me of in Mark 12 where we hear about the story of the rich young ruler, and it's the one text where it says, and Jesus looked at him and loved him. And the rich young ruler, like, he missed the look. He didn't see the look. It's kind of like, I see Willie waving.
Yeah.
And it's hard for me to see the look. Instead, like, it activates all my other stuff. And I hear Jesus saying, I want you to pay attention to my gaze. And I want you to pay attention to it as it really is, which means you're going to have to practice. I don't want you to pay attention to it through the lens of your current attachment pattern. I'm not coming to kill you, like Adam and Eve thought God was coming to do. I'm coming to find you. I'm coming to recommission you. Nothing you're doing surprises me. I never run out of options.
It's good.
Yep.
Thank God for earned attachment.
Thank God for it.
Yeah, right on.
And
for Willie.
And for Willie.
Yeah.
This podcast is produced by Kurt Thompson, Pepper Sweeney, and myself, Amy Chella. Audio production and music is by Keaton Simons. If you'd like to connect with us, you can visit us on our website, beingknownpodcast.com, or you can find us on social media at beingknownpod. Be well, be known.